And just a warm welcome from myself and the PBC team. I'm Andrew. I'm one of the consultants here at PBC, but I'm currently seconded on the business development side. So I'm helping while Carolina is on maternity leave. Many of you, I'm sure, know the wonderful Carolina Fox. She looks after our channel partners. So I'm assisting in that regard. Our channel partners are often the people that will be on selling our products, and we really aim to support them with things like this, the webinar, just providing resources and that additional support on their projects. I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers for today, and we'll let them possibly more fully introduce themselves when they start. But one of our speakers is Rashik. So he's the senior account manager. He looks after some of our biggest clients, and they have the most complex requirements often. So you're in good hands when it comes to the customization requirements from that perspective. And then Greg, he's joining us from New Zealand. Rashik's based here in Sydney with me, but Greg's in New Zealand, moved there from Australia, but we're not holding that against him, that he wanted to move. And he's a registered psychologist, and he's also one of our principal consultants here at PBC. So again, wealth of knowledge. You're going to learn a lot, no doubt. Some housekeeping rules. Today's session is recorded. I think, well, I hope many of you noted that it was already being recorded, so bear that in mind. Similarly, you'll receive that recording and some support material after the fact. Just again, some collateral, and if there's anything we didn't specifically address, you'll get that in hand. And I think one of the main things to be aware of is that you're all on mute. I'm not quite sure if you can unmute yourself. My understanding is no. Apologies for that. If you wouldn't mind just putting all your comments in the chat, what I'm going to do is I'm going to curate that, and we're going to have a Q&A at the end of the session, and Rashik and Greg will answer some of the more poignant questions. But with that said, the topic today is customizing the Hogan 360, and it's the why, the when, and the how. What we found, why this was such a salient topic, was that we became aware that many of our clients, the channel partners, people that we're selling to, aren't aware of the capabilities around customization of the 360. And there's really a gamut. There's a spectrum of options there. And we wanted to make everyone aware of that fact, not just because it can elevate your own projects by using this as an offering, but more specifically, sometimes the clients that you work with, they require customization, options, mapping, etc. So this session is really kind of designed to give you a sense of what those options are. And without further ado, with that said, I'm going to hand over to Greg and Rashik. Enjoy, everyone.
Thank you, Andrew. So, hi, everyone. As Andrew said, I'm a principal consultant, organisational psychologist. I've had a long career in all sorts of different spaces, which I won't bore you with now. But I first got exposed to the Hogan assessment back in the early 2000s. So I think it's about 25 years ago that I was first trained into Hogan. And obviously, since I've been working with PBC over the last 5 years or 6 or so as initially an associate, and then for most of that time permanent in-house. I've had a lot of exposure to the Hogan 360 as well. So just very briefly, I'm sure most of you know about PBC, but you know, the business was set up by Peter Berry in 1990, so it's coming up for 35 years now, so 3.5 decades. Full service HR consulting, leadership development consulting firm right across the spectrum, starting with analytics, strong science orientation with most of the staff here, and of course with their involvement with Hogan. We're the distributors of the Hogan products across Australia and New Zealand, and I think we're the sort of biggest, best distributor in their whole network. So that's probably enough on PBC. As I say, I'm sure most of you are pretty familiar with what we do and the range of offerings that we provide. So let's move on. We'll look at the 360 itself. So again, I thought we'd just throw up some numbers here because the 360 is a fantastic tool. The Hogan 360 was actually developed by PBC, and so there's quite a lot of research that sits behind it. The latest count, we have over 44,000 managers and professionals at all levels that have been through this process from all over the world. So there's a lot of data that sits behind it. You'll see there over 500,000 respondents that have provided feedback on those managers and professionals from companies, big and small, from all over the world. I think about 3/4 of Fortune 500 companies use Hogan products. So some very reputable organizations, big global businesses, national businesses, as well as smaller businesses in every industry and sector that you could possibly think of. The standard 360. So we're going to give you a little bit of information about the standard 360, just so you get a sense of the ballpark that we're playing in. So one of the sort of 4 core characteristics, if you like, that are associated with the Hogan 360. The first of those is that it provides a really good measure of a leader reputation. We'll talk a little bit about the model that we use shortly, but I think one of the fairly unique characteristics of the Hogan 360 is that it's got a strong technical support. So we've done some validity and reliability research to ensure that the competencies that we're measuring and the questions that we ask around those competencies are actually valid, and they are measuring what we say they're measuring. You'd expect this from any psychometric. Weirdly enough, we don't put the same kind of criteria on our expectations around 360s. So, but we've gone that extra mile, and we provide you with good technical validity and reliability data to show that, what we're saying is being measured is actually what's being measured. The leadership model that we use, it's a great model. It revolves around how people manage themselves, how they manage others, how they deal with their day job, sort of working in the business, and then the value add piece in terms of working on the business. Plus, we'll often slice and dice that model in a few different ways so that, for instance, we can look at what are the behaviors that people bring to the picture, what about their business competency, and then we can look at it in terms of what about their managerial orientation versus their leadership orientation. And slicing and dicing that model provides quite a unique perspective that gives some really high-level understanding for people of how they're going across those 4 areas of leadership. We've also got, as you expect, with a wealth of data that I talked about, we're able to compare and contextualize people's scores across a range of different benchmarks. We typically use the global benchmark. These days, most businesses are operating in an increasingly global world. So, but we can do industry benchmarking, public sector, private sector, all sorts of industries, again, as well as career levels, so managerial levels. And one of the other things that's fairly unique to the Hogan 360 is their use of the top strengths and top opportunities as one of the mechanisms within the 360 to help people prioritize what their development areas, where they should be. And this can then get fleshed out, of course, with the body of the 360, the comments, the overall ratings for different questions and so forth. So let's move on to the next slide, Rashik. So as I've mentioned, there is a technical manual. You should expect a technical manual with any 360. Your providers should be able to, any provider should be able to provide you with this kind of data. It's really fundamental. If the test or the questionnaire is not valid, it's not measuring what people think it's measuring, you're on a road to nowhere. We provide an overall score. Not all 360s do that. But, at the end of the day, people are saying, well, I'm okay at this, I'm not so good at that, but how am I going overall? So the overall score is a good high-level 1-point measure on our 7-point scale of where people sit within that benchmark. It also means that we can help people target, well, if your score was 5.7, which is the average, then let's aim for a higher score next time. I've mentioned the global benchmarks across industries and sectors at different levels. We can provide top 10% quartile scores as well as bottom 10%. I mentioned the strengths and opportunities table, so that provides a unique opportunity. We've identified 30 common strengths that most managers tend to demonstrate, as well as 30 common opportunities for development based on the research across those literally tens of thousands of surveys. And we ask people to rank those top few items, and we can give people this is all about your brand. What's your brand saying in terms of the strengths that you bring, that maybe sometimes how do you kind of mess it up? What could you be working on? Then, of course, there is the custom options, which is what we're here to talk about today. So I won't elaborate too much on that right this second. But and of course, value for money. We actually, I think, we offer a very competitive entry point. In fact, it's a free entry point, and then very competitive pricing. So once you're certified with either online training or webinar, then the pricing is very competitive in terms of each individual 360. So if we go on to the next slide, Rashik. So some of the common applications, obviously career coaching is one of the core elements, and that's probably a very common use, helping provide people with some strategic self-awareness of their reputation. 360 is always a bit of a snapshot in time, so they do give a snapshot in terms of behavior. But as Peter Berry says, when you put 360 results together with personality results, there's no place to hide. We've got here's the why and here's the what. So you put those two things together, and it gives people a really clear picture of how they're operating and how people are seeing. But there's some other interesting applications of 360s. We're able to look at team building, identifying what are some of the strengths across a team, what about some of their opportunities. 360s have been used very successfully in helping with succession planning, especially the developmental piece for succession planning. And of course, as part of that team development, the ultimate aim is to be building the high-performing team. And we've got some other products to support that, but I won't digress into those. Leadership development, again, helping identify talent, identifying particular cohort strengths and needs. So we've done lots of research with different clients around identifying the strengths and the opportunities that are associated with particular groups of people within an organization. And then at the organizational level, using that data to help inform what are some of our key needs as a business, as an organization. What does this mean in terms of our learning and development opportunities and OD opportunities around organizational change? Let's move on to the next slide, Rashik. Thanks. So again, you can see a number of applications here, and I've mentioned some of these. But some other interesting ones, just perhaps to note, the transition from manager to leader, because of the way the leadership model works within the 360, helping managers identifying what am I doing as a manager that works, but what do I need to be doing as a leader to kind of transition from that manager level into the leader level. 360s can be useful in terms of helping people with restructuring and succession planning, in terms of helping, again, identify people's needs around going forward. We've used 360s as well to help with dysfunctional teams. It's a nice complement to the high-performing team assessment, but helping identify, for instance, where there might be siloed behavior that is going on, where people are perhaps too focused on either their own teams, this sort of functional siloing. Perhaps they're not sort of focusing enough on team one. So that sort of team one versus team two, that's a really clear pickup, especially in the group 360s that we can run. We've used them very successfully at the board level, helping inform behavior that boards looking for from CEOs, for instance. And I've talked a bit about talent analytics and return on investment. So again, I won't labour those points. So look, I think that's it from me on this little section. So Rashik, I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, Greg. And definitely a few of the projects, custom 360 projects I'm working on with different clients fall into some of these categories. A couple in the post-restructure environment. One significant project I'm working on succession planning, where it's a healthcare organization, and we conducted a review of their framework. Several diagnostics are being used, including a custom 360 mapped to the finalized framework. And the results of all these diagnostics are being used as part of a development center, which includes coaching to improve the capability of these individuals and get them ready for succession. So that touches on a few of these different applications. So that takes us on to why. So as an account manager, I am speaking to our clients on a daily basis. And customization isn't for everyone, and there is definitely certain circumstances and timing around when a customization would be helpful. So some of the things that I hear and that my colleagues hear around when a customization is appropriate include these points. So a very common one is that we want to measure our leaders against the capabilities that we know we need here. So whether we have a framework or success profiles or some other way of defining what we know good looks like and what we're looking for. And now we need to measure specifically against that. Another one is that we don't have our own framework. However, we would like to build one and measure against it. Or we're trying to iterate on our framework after, say, a restructure. So in this occasion, PBC can actually help build your framework as well before doing the mapping exercise and doing the customization exercise for a 360. And in all of these occasions, we hear from the customers that they want to measure with reliability, validity, and benchmarks. So some of what Greg was referring to, having all of that scientific basis to the 360 really gives you that validity of the model. Another one is that we see that they like our standard model. It captures most of what the client is looking for, but they may have a few specific additional things that they need to look at. We have clients that want different feedback emphases across different levels of leadership. So there might be slightly different requirements that they have across different levels of seniority, whether it might be first-time managers, mid-level managers, senior managers, exec. And then finally, a consistent theme that we see across all of our customization projects is that the client typically wants all developmental conversations anchored to their framework and using their own organizational language. So that can be very powerful. So in terms of a custom 360, these are the three main things that you can get out of that, is that you measure what matters, you create a consistent employee experience, and you can understand behavioral change. So in terms of the measurement, you can connect organizational competencies to performance and engagement data, such as KPIs, engagement surveys, organizational performance. And this can be done through customizing the report to measure those exact competencies that you care about and integrating that data into your talent processes to inform development planning and talent management, whether that's the ongoing individual development planning of a person or feeding into larger talent management objectives, such as succession planning. In terms of creating a consistent employee experience, you create that consistent messaging and experience aligned to the organizational competencies and language, and that can be so powerful. Instead of introducing new languages, new terminology, everything is in terms of the framework or the agreed language of the organization's values, and that can really help to drive the outcomes. And then finally, as Greg was saying, 360 in its very nature is a measure at a point in time. However, when you customize a 360 and you utilize it across different cohorts across a long period of time, where you may even get the same people repeating the 360 after a year or two, you start to build up a rich bank of organizational data, and you can actually analyze this data to see what the changes have been, and again correlate that back into organizational data, such as bottom line, top line profitability, broad organizational objectives, to really hone in on and understand which are the impact capabilities that are driving the performance of your organization. So we have a few options to customize. First of all is the standard 360 option with no customization. So that's off the shelf. 50 rate on scale items, top strengths and opportunities tables, and 3 open text questions with standard benchmarking and global language options available. So that's your off the shelf Hogan 360. We find is best for organizations starting out with a 360 or ad hoc usage, or organizations where the base 360 model that we have covers everything that they're looking for and they don't have any further specific requirements. Then we have the standard Hogan 360 plus the complementary customization options, which includes, as Greg mentioned before, some different benchmarks around industry or geography that we can apply, up to 3 additional rate on scale item banks and up to 2 additional free text questions. So this is for organizations who have, those few additional areas that they're looking to really measure on top of the standard Hogan 360 model. And then we have the fully customized Hogan 360. So that measures against the competency framework or the success profile or whatever other framework that you have. It can incorporate your logo, your branding all throughout the report. We can actually offer custom benchmarking for 100 or more reports. Once we have 100 or more reports, we can do a custom benchmark for your organization, or we can even look at other types of custom benchmarks from existing data. We can also develop customized individual development plans that build off the results of the 360. And then there are some other options in terms of the administration, the data, and the platform as well. And that's best for the organizations that really want to measure against your competencies and be able to benefit from doing that. So with the standard Hogan 360 model, it looks at 14 core competencies across 4 pillars, if you will. So that's self-management, relationship management, working in the business, and working on the business. So referring back to some of what Greg was explaining before, there's different ways to cut these pillars. So if you look at just the self-management and the working in the business, we call those management competencies. And if you look at the relationship management and the working on the business, they're leadership competencies. And there's different ways that you can actually analyze this data. So the standard Hogan 360 model is quite comprehensive and is a very strong model. We also have 2 other off-the-shelf 360 options, the high potential 360 and the leader focus 360. So the high potential 360 uses the Hogan high potential model. And that model looks at your leadership foundations, which are the building blocks for career effectiveness, leadership emergence, which is the likelihood of a person to be perceived as a leader, so their leader-like behaviors and to be noticed as a leader. And then that leadership effectiveness, which is the ability to build and maintain high-performing teams. Another one of Peter Berry's favorite quotes is, "Judge the leader by the team." The performance of a team can be very much demonstrate the effectiveness of the leader. So the high potential 360 is typically used for emerging leaders or newer leaders to help them improve and realize their potential. And then the leader focus 360 is a model that's targeted towards more aspirational leaders. And that really just looks at the leadership style that individual is likely to be the strongest at or to succeed most easily at. Looking at the complementary customization options available, these are some examples of the up to 3 additional item banks that I mentioned earlier. Each of these item banks has a different number of items within them, and we allow for up to 3 additional item banks. So again, some ones that I've been working on with some of my clients recently that have been popular are change management, agile leadership, and diversity and inclusion seem to be quite popular in the market at the moment, but you can choose up to 3 of these additional item banks to add to the 50 core Hogan rate on scale items. And then with some of the additional benchmarks available, here are just some examples to demonstrate, in terms of industry, sector, geography. There are many different types of additional benchmarks that we can offer to the off-the-shelf Hogan 360 as a complementary customization. And then finally, this is a very quick example of what a custom 360 for your organization might look like. You will receive a full sample report as part of the follow-up email and supporting resources to this webinar. But just to highlight, obviously it will be mapped to your model or your framework. That's what that little circumflex demonstrates. So that will be your framework. It will have your branding and language and colors. It can have custom benchmarking if you want, custom development plans on the end. And, there is some flexibility in terms of the layout as well. But the core customization, when you look at a full customization, is that mapping to your framework. And that's where the main value comes out of. And then having that shared language that's utilized in your organization coming out of this report as well. So, Greg, over to you to speak a little bit about the how. Oh, you're on mute, Greg.
That's going to be very helpful. Yeah. So we've heard a bit about why might we want to do this. So let's dig into a bit more detail around the how and the mechanics of working through this process. So let's move on to the next slide, Rashik. There we go. So there's a few underlying principles that it's important to work to, that regardless of the extent of customization that you want to engage in, but that we would be keeping in mind with all of the activity that would follow. So the first is that, and Rashid sort of touched on this, that building people's awareness of the organizational competencies and the desired behaviors. So reinforcing the messaging that you have in a business, or that a client of yours has in a business, around what they're expecting from people in terms of both organizational competencies and any associated behaviors that are connected with those. We want to make sure that we maintain the reliability and the validity of the instrument. So some of the steps that we'll work through will be adhering to that, to make sure that we're not compromising the integrity of the data that we're collecting. So, for instance, in that respect, we wouldn't look to, we can look to making minor tweaks to questions, but we wouldn't look to rewriting questions in a wholesale sort of way. So we have a large bank of questions that we know tend to relate to certain competencies, and part of the mapping exercise is to make sure that we attach the right questions to the appropriate competency, and that it's going to maintain the reliability and the validity of the instrument. That's not to say we can't tweak questions subtly, but we would need to talk with you to work out, the best wording. So there may be certain words that you, for instance, might like to see that represent just the way you describe things in your own business. But as long as it doesn't compromise the core intent of the question, we can make those subtle changes. It's also important to be able to maintain benchmarking integrity. If we've got lots of questions that are completely new and novel, we don't have any benchmark data on those questions, whereas we do with the existing existing question bank. So that maintains the benchmarking integrity if we're using existing questions. And that's supported really by, I guess, this next comment too, that by using items and Hogan from either the item bank or looking at relationships with the Hogan competency model and the Hogan personality assessments, we've done quite a lot of research looking at the connections between competencies, items, and the Hogan competencies and personality assessments. So if you're using a battery of assessments, like common to see people doing Hogan assessments as well as the 360, we can look at, well, what are the personality characteristics that are associated with, say, a high resilience score, or good communication skills, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of valuable information that if we compromise the integrity of the questions, that would compromise that sort of the utility of that data. Also, of course, there's a strong academic basis to what we're doing, established business practices. So we want to make sure that we continue to adhere to those kind of basic underlying principles. And then the last one there, but does provide an opportunity to measure your own competency framework and look at this objectively, look at it objectively and consistently. And it's possible that there may be even some tweaks that could be suggested in the way that the model that you're using has been set up. So I won't get too much into those. All right, let's go on to the next slide, Rashik. So now you can see there's a raft of elements that are involved in customization. I'm not going to talk through all of these points individually, but you'll have access to this after the workshop. But there are a series of steps that we work through. There's another slide that we'll come on to shortly that maps this out in terms of the process. But you can see there that we'd start with an initial review of the framework and then work through an item mapping exercise to your framework. And it's usually most of the mapping that we do, probably 97–98% of the mapping that we do is at the item level. So we're taking specific questions from our item bank, linking them to your capabilities or competencies. We then provide that first draft, if you like, through to you or to your clients for review and refinement. We can make some tweaks, as I say, to some of the questions, and that changes to static text is more about the body of the 360 report itself. So talking to your leadership model or your competency model or other elements that are kind of unique to your organization. Then there's a series of steps that involve with setting up the survey itself. These are probably better covered in the next slide, so I won't go on to those. But we'd have a draft report design. We'll look at some internal Q&A. We always Q&A every report, as well as the opportunity, of course, for the client to Q&A what's being provided. So there's a list of standard inclusions with the standard customization that include things like one review, a review of the mapping, another separate review of the report itself. So if you want additional reviews, then that sort of would be costed separately. And then you can see on the right-hand side of this slide that there are some other options that can be provided. Again, we would need to provide some costing around those, but where we might, for instance, look at customizing benchmarks outside of the standard. And then, for instance, down the bottom, you can see use of multi-factor authentication or single sign-on if you're using a range of other Hogan assessments, and so people can just sort of enter into one point of contact to access all of the assessments. Okay, let's move on to the next slide, Rashik. So this maps some of the information that was on the previous slide, and you can see it in more of a timeline here and some of the key milestones. So the project would kick off with the confirmation of the scope, working out exactly what it is that you're expecting, sign off on that statement of work, and then getting some of the kind of basic information that we need from you around logo, branding, etc. Then we'd work through the competency mapping. So one of our PBC consultants, typically one of the research team, will conduct that mapping exercise, and we will provide you a copy of that to review, get your sign off on it. We can make some changes. And it's during that we might make some tweaks to the questions, sort of move items around, but you do that all in consultation with us and the experts from the research team to help guide that initial setup. Once we've got that set up, then we can get into the administration phase of a project, providing people with access. So your administration team, providing them with access to the questionnaires and the tools, and providing super user training in terms of setting things up using Qualtrics. So the 360 is managed through Qualtrics, so I'm sure many of you have heard of, and then also customizing any communications templates. So there'll be a standard set of communications that are going out around 360s, both pre, during, and post as well. So we would help you set those up. Then there's certifications, so just making sure that all the coaches, everyone is going to be using the 360, providing feedback. They're all skilled up and trained. So we'd be providing, setting all of that up, and then getting ready for the launch itself. So we will help you configure the project, make sure that any IT hurdles have been picked up on, and your IT system's not going to block people from accessing emails or the questionnaires themselves. So, and then finally, survey launch, where people get the chance to choose their, well, again, this would be something that would be decided in consultation with you. Who's going to be, how do people select their evaluators? Are there any rules around the number of categories you want, the number of respondents that you want in each category, how people manage that? And then, of course, who's getting a copy of the report? Is it just going to the individual? Would it be going anywhere else? But again, there needs to be some real clarity around how that particular part of the process is managed. People will have expectations based on this of what's happening with their data. And these days, people are very conscious of their data, both being looked after, which of course we have all of the right things in place to make sure that the data doesn't go astray, but also people want to know internally within the organization what's happening to this. Is it just being used for this purpose? Is it going to be used for any other purposes? I think there needs to be a lot of clarity around that to make sure that everybody's happy with why the data is being used. And then finally, once everyone's completed the surveys, the reports are generated, and then shared out. And again, there'll be some steps in that process that we can support you with in terms of how you manage the actual distribution of reports. So I think that's all from me, isn't it, Bashik, on this section? It's over to you.
Thanks, Greg. It's just finding the unmute button. Yes, so thank you for that. And a few other quick comments to build on what Greg said on this slide. If you look, it's about a 12-week turnaround from start to the end of the customization process itself to get the custom 360 ready. That's an estimate. As you can see, it's very much a co-design partnership type process. So there will be involvement from PBC, but also from the client in terms of reviews. So if we're doing more than one rounds of reviews, depending on the number of capabilities that are being mapped to, depending on some of those additional options that Greg was talking about, like single sign-on or MFA or some of the other options, this timeline may change, but it is a rough indicative of about 12 weeks. And then after you've got the custom 360 ready, obviously, you can get a cohort launch straight away, but then you have that 360 available to you, obviously, for any kind of usage across your organization moving forward. And if you do get PBC's help to review or create or iterate on your own capability framework, that would happen before week 0, of course, and that component would need to be done before we, do the project kickoff as mentioned in this timeline. So to finish off, I thought we'd talk through a case study of a public sector organization that the PBC delivered a custom 360 for. So for a bit of context, back in 2012, there was a statewide audit, and it was revealed that there was a need for talent and a lift in the capability of this state government's people. And a year later, there was a mandate passed to actually do something about lifting that capability, and an organization was created within the government to ensure this lift in capability across that government organization. Then fast forward another few years, we get to 2020, and there were some further learnings and insights that the individual development of, the individual leadership capability development was actually going to be a key driver to retaining the public sector employees, and that was actually a critical factor to this mandate. And the 360 that had been used up until that point, it was an off-the-shelf. It was not aligned to the capability framework of this government organization. And so they weren't able to directly measure against their capabilities. And so within that same year, there was a need identified for a customized 360 mapped to this government's capability framework. and PBC was commissioned to deliver this custom 360. So in this particular example, it took some years to get to that point of deciding on a custom 360, but it highlights that understanding the why is very important before proceeding on a custom 360 journey. But once you do understand the why, if there is a value to it, it becomes almost a no-brainer to see how important it can be. And there's a quick snapshot of that co-design process. So this, I suppose, is a parallel to the slide that Greg was speaking to in terms of the rough timelines, but more in the context of this particular project. The client actually went through a process of doing a lot of research, internal and external, and market research, and understanding their needs, understanding strategic objectives and what was required. Once they did all of that and they decided to proceed with a custom 360 with their framework, PBC came in to deliver that model. And it was done in partnership and in co-design with the client. So following on from what Greg was talking about, that at every step of the process, it was passed on to the client for socialization, for feedback, for review, and for sign-off. And so we provided that end-to-end delivery of the custom 360. And once the custom 360 was delivered, also the supporting resources like that qualification webinar and additional resources to help the employees of this organization be able to debrief the 360s themselves, which gives you a very strong ROI because you can do that in-house, and it makes it a lot more cost effective to use the 360s. And then we've been providing, since this happened, ongoing support to the client from an organizational level, but also from an individual level in terms of supporting the internal coaches and supporting the organization to be able to continue getting the most out of the custom 360. And so what did that custom 360 look like? Well, it measured against that state's capability framework and helped the leaders to develop the attributes, mindsets, and behaviors necessary to deliver a world-class public service. So in terms of supporting the leaders develop those leadership areas that are of the most impact, that embody the core values and core behaviors of the state government, of what is expected, not only of the leaders in that state government, but any employee. And the benchmarks that we used were global in this particular occasion, and there were 50 standard items plus 21 additional custom items in this particular 360. So there's 71 rate on scale items in addition to the top strengths and opportunities table and the open-ended questions. So as an example, that's how this landed. That is on the higher end in terms of the number of items. Depending on the client's framework and how it maps to our items in the Hogan 360 item bank, it could be the same, similar, less that it ends up with. And in terms of the impacts and the results, well, there was a successful implementation of the statewide 360 to support the capability framework. And we've lost count how many thousands of staff have actually done the 360 across this government organization since it was developed, and through many different applications as well. So formal annual leadership programs, projects that are specific to a certain department or certain portfolio, ad hoc usage, different new programs. So for example, one of the examples I mentioned earlier was a government organization in terms of succession planning. So the government 360 is being used there as well. So there's numerous applications to this across the entire state. And that consistent coaching and development for the senior leaders with that consistent language in terms of the capability framework, and being able to evaluate the leadership capability within and across departments. So within the state government agency, they have the ability to look within certain departments in terms of the results of the 360s and understanding the areas of improvement, but they can actually look across the entire state government portfolio as well and look at the benchmark across the entire portfolio to understand how a certain individual within a certain department stacks up against all of their peers across the entire state department. The entire state government. And that really brings us to the end of the main part of the presentation. So Greg, unless you had any further comments to add, we might hand over to Andrew to see if we have any questions.
No, nothing more from me, Rashik. Yeah, I think that's covered it nicely.
Yeah, thank you both so much. That was really informative. Really appreciate it. There hasn't been that many questions. Only one. So if people do want a bit of time to think about that, and you have any burning questions, please just put them in the chat. But Rashik, Greg, there was one from Dieter. It was both a statement and a question. I would be interested to know if there's any benchmarking for doctors, and I don't know if you want to make that broader in the sense of not just the doctors to speak to that, but also if there's other benchmarks involved and what the process might be to find that out and how we can work with our clients there.
Yeah, I can maybe provide some initial comments at least. So what for anything like this, what we would need to do is look to data and dissect it basically. So as you pointed out in your response there, Andrew, there are health sector senior leader benchmarks. But determining, for instance, how many doctors are in there, we would need to dig into that data. So there'd be some analysis that would be required, some data cleaning to try and identify those people, if we can even do that. It may not be possible to do that, but it's a good question. And I think Rashik also made the comment that when it comes to benchmarks, we're typically looking for a minimum of about 100 people in any grouping. So whether it's an industry grouping, it's a sector, it's a level, it's an occupation, we really need at least 100 data points to be able to provide that data. And that same thing would be applied in the case of any unique questions that you might want to include in the 360. So as I said before, we can make minor tweaks to certain questions, but if there were questions that weren't in the database that you wanted to use, we would need to build up some responses from individuals in order to be able to provide a benchmark for those down the track. But it would mean that initially some of those benchmarks may not be available depending on the questions you use. So, yeah. I'm just looking at this question. So there's another question there from Natalie, which is, if you customize the 360, does that automatically flow to the personality assessment outputs? The capabilities to measure against are going to be the same for both. It would depend a little bit on the structure of which items we're feeding into the capabilities to be able to answer that. So it may not be an automatic. There may not be an automatic flow at the item level. But again, that's something that we could do down the track. But that's a reasonably complicated process. So yeah, I might ask one of the research team about this, and that we could perhaps with some of these questions, if we don't answer it completely, we will provide a bit of a Q&A response. And we might get one of the research team to make a comment about this, just to make sure that we're providing you with the best and most up-to-date information. So
if I can just add to that as well, Greg, in terms of the personality and 360, it can be very powerful to map both within your organization, Natalie, and as you've mentioned and maybe alluding to, 360 is a measurement of a behavior at a point in time. Personality is looking to predict the behavior. And so if you understand both in the context of your framework and what success and what good looks like, that can be very powerful, especially in the sense of how it feeds back into the way you recruit and select for talent, because then with enough custom 360 data, you can then be informed of what types of personality scales are likely to actually predict for the best success against your competency framework. So that is definitely something that can be very powerful if relevant to your organization.
And then there's another one here about the confidentiality. So I'll just read it out. In terms of the confidentiality with report results, is this based on the initial contracting with the org? I use Hogan 360 and the Hogan New South Wales Government 360, and I've always told the clients the results are confidential, but that they may wish to share them if they choose. But in terms of succession planning or capability development, etc., are individual participants identified? So there's a lot in there, gents. I don't know if you can assist with what's the general process, any recommendations, thoughts on confidentiality, and then identifying respondents.
Look, I can maybe provide an initial comment because I do lots of feedbacks as well, especially with the government 360, and I always operate. So our starting point is typically the only person getting a copy of the 360 is the individual themselves. And it's not going to anybody else. It's not being sent to their manager. It's not being sent to HR, but that's the starting point. So that's what I would always say to people, and that's my understanding of certainly the way government use it. With the group reporting that we were talking about, so looking at sort of organizational implications from, say, a group of reports, the group reports don't identify individuals. They will look at average scores across the items, across the different areas of the 360, to highlight what's working well, what's not going so well, what are some of the sort of areas for focus. In the case of using them, for instance, say with succession planning or those other kinds of purposes that we've touched on, it would be I would say it's essential that be clearly articulated to people so that they know that this is being used for that purpose. If you haven't articulated that to people, then you shouldn't use it in that way. You need to go back to them and say, look, this is, can we get your permission to use this in this sense, and get people's permission. But it's a potentially on, can I say this, on thin ice. 360s are a really good tool for development, and you have to think very carefully about using them outside of a developmental context, because then people might sort of start to question them. And then you start running into problems with, who am I going to choose for my raters? If I know this is being used to assess me for some other purpose, I'm just going to choose my friends and make sure they give me good ratings. So then the validity of the data comes into question. But look, that's a whole other workshop probably, and we'd probably run another webinar on confidentiality issues. But I think those are the broad themes. Is it Neven? I'm not sure if that answers your question, but yeah.
And to build on that as well, Greg, as an example in that succession planning piece, for example, we would recommend using it as part of the development component of any succession planning program or initiative, not necessarily to select into the program. So that would be our recommendation that aligns with the intended use of a 360. So if that helps as well.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, very good point, Rashik. Yeah, it's very important to keep that developmental focus, I think, on 360s. It really blurs the lines if you start stepping much outside that.
I'm just aware of the time, and there aren't any other questions that I've noted here. We might put together a couple extra questions that we commonly come across, and to Greg's point, marketing will send that out to you with some of the answers, probably about a week's time, I guess. But that said, I just want to thank you both, Rashik, Greg, for your insights, for taking us through that, but also for the marketing team. They make these events happen. So thank you to the team there. And then again, just an FYI, you can expect the slides, the collateral, some of the answers in about a week or so. But thank you all for joining, attending, your contributions, your insights. Really do appreciate it. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Bye, everyone.